Greetings in the name of the Most High Yahuwah and his Son Yahusha to the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad. I am Brother Hiram, and in this video I am going to bring you my Shabbat testimony. So, as many of you already know, that I have an entire YouTube channel dedicated to the Shabbat and talking about the Shabbat. It's called the Synchronized Shabbat. And so I call it the Synchronized Shabbat. Some of you may know it as the Lunar Shabbat or Solar Lunar Shabbat. The reason why I call it the Synchronized Shabbat is because it synchronizes with the major feast days. That the Shabbat, as it falls on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th of each lunar month, because it is reset by the new moon, that causes it to coincide and synchronize with the first day of unleavened bread and the first day of Sukkot. And so with the 8th day convocation of Sukkot being a 7th day Shabbat, and as well as the day after the last day of unleavened bread, we see that both of the major festivals, the fall and the spring festivals, are encapsulated in the 7th day Shabbat like an envelope. And so the pilgrims, the travelers would come and they would open things up with Shabbat. They would keep the feast. They would close things out with Shabbat, and they would go home. And that is how I believe that the Most High has ordained it, that they would have a full worship experience when they would come to worship Yahuwah on the major festival days. So, brothers and sisters, what I want you to know in this testimony is that I have not always believed this. And so, in case you're wondering, how did I come to believe the Shabbat the way that I do, I want to give you this testimony, and hopefully you'll be able to connect with this. So, I've been in this truth movement for about 30 years now. Now, I've been a believer in Yah and his son Yahusha for about 33 years. But, when I first came to belief, I was just in the regular Christian churches. But I did not start coming into more truth, like as we know it, like Torah truth, until about 30 years ago. And my concept of Shabbat back then was the Roman first day of the week, so the Roman Sunday. So when I first started keeping Shabbat as I understood it, I was actually keeping Roman Sunday like a lot of people keep Roman Saturday. I wouldn't work on that day. There's a preacher that I was sitting under that firmly believed in setting apart the first day of the week. And so I did that with him like that. And so I believed it. I believed in the concept of Shabbat. I just kept it on Roman Sunday. I considered that to be the Christian Shabbat. But what happened was that I saw that challenged, and it was challenged by the notion of the Roman Saturday, the Roman 7th day Shabbat. And so when the Most High started opening my eyes to how Roman Sunday is not the Shabbat, then what I started doing was I went to a Seventh-day Adventist church and I got all the literature that I could get. Now, they came up to me and said, "Hey, you're welcome to come into service," because it was a Roman Saturday. And I said, "No, I just want some literature because I want to study on my own." And I remember going to a park and just studying all day about Shabbat. And so I came to the understanding that the Roman Saturday, the Roman 7th day, was the Shabbat, because to me it was more correct than the Roman Sunday. To me, it was a matter of is the Shabbat the seventh day, or is the Shabbat the first day? And so I came to the understanding that Shabbat is the seventh day. And what I found was that uh, everybody who I ran across who called themselves Sabbath keepers, that's how they kept it. They kept it on Roman Saturday, the seventh day of the Roman week, and you'll hear me also call it the Jewish Sabbath. And so, in American society, they call the Roman Saturday the Jewish Sabbath, and then they call the Roman Sunday the Christian Sabbath for Christians who call themselves keeping Sabbath. And so everybody kept it like that. I never saw it challenged. See, the reason why that I didn't keep Roman Sunday anymore, because I saw it challenged. And the Seventh day Adventists and other groups, they did a real good job of showing how the correct day is not Pagan Sunday. But concerning Pagan Saturday, the Roman seventh day, I never saw it challenged. I never heard anybody challenge it. It just seemed universal that that's when Shabbat is. That's when everybody keeps Shabbat. Well, I had an encounter, and this was in 2001, I believe. I went to a camp meeting, and I was speaking to a young lady there, and I was very zealous, for truth, and always wanting to know more truth. And so we were talking, me and this young lady, and she was talking about how she was going to go do something, and just arbitrarily, I'll throw it out, as far as just one of the days of the week, like she would say, well, we're going to go on Tuesday and do such and such, just to give an example of something that she might have said. And so I challenged her on that. I said, well, why do you venerate false deities, with the names of the days of the week, because the Torah says that we're not supposed to memorialize the names of other gods, because that is a belief I had come to sometime before then, that we are to call the days of the week first day of the week, second day of the week, third day of the week, etc., like it does in the Bible, like that we are not to venerate the false deities. And people may ask, well, how do you get along in this world, if you do that? And one bit of wisdom that I believe I was given concerning this was that if I'm making reference to one of the days of the week and I'm talking to somebody and I'm dealing with business, that I will say, well, we can come on your Monday, or we can come on your Tuesday. And I'm speaking truth, because it's not my Monday. It's not my moon god day. It's not my TU's day like that. It's theirs, because it's to venerate their gods. And so that's how I would get around that issue in dealing with business. But, I called this young lady out on that, because I perceived that she was a truth seeker. I said, why do you venerate the names of the pagan gods when you talk about the days of the week? And she counter challenged me, and she said, well, why do you keep the Sabbath on a pagan Gregorian calendar? And this was the first time I ever heard the Jewish Sabbath, Roman seventh day Sabbath, challenged by anyone. Now, I saw the Roman Sunday being challenged. The Seventh day Adventists put out a book called the National Sunday Law. And, that's a widely publicized book. They did a great job of picking the Roman Sunday concept of Shabbat, picking it apart. They did a great job of that. But as far as the Roman Saturday, traditional Sabbath, Jewish Sabbath, I never heard anyone even challenge it until now. That's the first time. And so, I was having a Bill Cosby moment. I was saying to myself, this is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. Man, I can't believe this. And, when she was explaining to me about keeping the Shabbat, by the luminaries, the sun, moon, and stars, and not by a pagan Gregorian calendar. And my thought was, everybody's doing it like this, though. I've never heard of anybody doing any different. What are you talking about? And so she said she'd send me some literature. So she sent me some literature, and I combed through it with a fine tooth comb, and the literature talked about how all ancient societies counted time by the luminaries at one time, and how the idea of just doing a man-made calendar that's disconnected from the luminaries is a modern thing. And also just going through the scriptures, talking about the doctrine concerning the solar lunar Shabbat. But I just did not get it at that time. And so I was on a quest to dismantle it and to debunk it, because, my thought was that, hey, that I should be telling her the truth. She shouldn't be telling me the truth. I should be telling her the truth. And so, I called myself debunking the lunar Shabbat. And I had made a name for myself around that time. This is 2001. I made quite a name for myself as a lunar Sabbath debunker. That there would be people who would come to me and they'd say, hey, I ran across some people that believe that lunar Sabbath. I need some scriptures so I can counter what they're saying, so I can debunk them. And I would give them passages of scripture to debunk the lunar Shabbat. You see, I wasn't convinced. And but what I didn't do, I didn't thoroughly look into it just to study it to see if it was truth, but I just looked everywhere I could to find some type of contradiction and to find some Sabbath in the Bible that did not fall on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th. And so I was looking for the debunk more zealously than I was looking for the truth. So anyway, I would say that after about a year or two of dealing with this young lady on this, I let it go. I wasn't convinced, and I just let it go. But I will say this, there's a radio program that I would listen to, and there's a young man named Matthew Jansen. He's pretty big in the Shabbat movement. Him and Arnold Bowen, that they did ministry together. And so they were real big in the Shabbat movement. And I would listen to their radio program. I didn't believe what they were saying, but I would listen to it. I would hear them out for probably about a year or so. I'd listen to their radio program. And then I went back to Louisiana in 2004, and I forgot all about it. Probably about a good 6 years, I forgot all about it. But in 2010, after all those years, it was revisited. I remember I got online because the ministry I was a part of in Louisiana, they didn't allow us to get on the internet. But so we got on the internet for the first time in 2010. And I remember, I think it was Facebook, and a man who had gotten in touch with me through my podcast, because I had a podcast at that time, Israelites for the Kingdom. That this is a man I just started, just having a relationship, discipleship type of relationship with, and he was someone who, kind of looked to me for leadership. And I saw that he was getting in a debate with somebody online about the lunar Shabbat. And so I jumped in on the thread, and I was saying to myself, I'm going to come and debunk this mess. And so I jumped in and I gave my 2 cents on the thread. And this young lady said, brother, please just, have an open mind. Here's a link. Just check the link out. And, I don't want to argue with you, but you just keep an open mind and check this out. And so I checked out the link. And when I checked out the link, it really surprised me, because it was a pretty prominent figure in the Hebrew roots and Messianic movement. And I saw that he had come to the understanding of the lunar-based Shabbat. And so that's what gave me a listening ear. And so I combed through just all the stuff that he had to say about that. And for the first time, I found myself really looking at this teaching with a open heart to receive truth. I wasn't looking at it to debunk necessarily. I was looking at it because I wanted to know truth. And just to make a long story short, I prayed, I fasted, I sought the Most High on this matter, and my eyes were opened. So my eyes were open to the truth of this matter, the truth of the solar lunar Shabbat, what I call now the synchronized Shabbat, because that, like I said, it synchronizes with the major feast days. But I came to that understanding, and when I make a major doctrinal change, see, I want to make sure I prove all things and hold fast that which is good. I want to make sure I'm not getting off into error, that I'm not being deceived. And so, one thing that I do is I find people who I believe are very strong in the belief that I'm departing from. And I put my belief to the test, just to see how well it holds up. And so, there is an old man, this is an older gentleman who he was, I think he used to be a Seventh day Adventist, but he's very strong in the Hebrew roots, I think two house Hebrew roots movement. He's very strong on Torah, and he's the strongest person who I knew of in the Sabbath, as far as the Jewish Sabbath, Roman Seventh day Sabbath. And so I brought to him my new belief. I said, I've come to believe Sabbath by the luminaries, and I want to present this to you, and I want to hear what you have to say. And I'm going to tell you, that old man, he brought everything to me but the kitchen sink. I mean, he gave me his all. He did his best to tear down what I was presenting to him. And what I found was that what I had come to believe, it was left standing on its own 2 feet when all the smoke cleared. He wasn't able to tear it down, and so to me, well, he's the strongest Roman Seventh Day keeper I know, and if he couldn't tear it down, then I don't believe it can be torn down. And so that's how I came to the understanding of the Sabbath counted by the luminaries in 2010. So it's been about 16 years, since I've been keeping it. But what I want to let you know is that, like I said, I've been in this truth seeker game for 30 years now. Like that, I've been a believer for longer, but I've been in this game for about 30 years as far as being a truth seeker, coming out of the churches, come out of Babylon, come out of her, my people. You be not a partaker of her sins and receive of her plagues. And, when I made my first move in 1995, I got away from the pagan holidays. And then I eventually took on what I call the starter package, what most people come into when they start their journey of truth. They come into the Sabbath, or, to the best of their understanding, they come into the clean foods, and then some people come into the original names, or what some call the sacred names. And that's what I call the starter package. And then eventually I moved on to just accepting all of Torah, that we're able to walk in here in captivity. Praise Yahuwah. But that it's been about 30 years in this truth journey, and I could honestly say that if I could put this in a nutshell, that I was keeping the Roman Sunday Shabbat, but when it was challenged, when I finally heard it challenged and challenged well, then I saw that it did not hold up, and so I switched to the Roman Saturday Shabbat. And for many years, I never heard it challenged. It was probably about a good 13 years, I would say, I kept it where I never heard it challenged by anybody. And what it took was that what it took for me, now I kept it 13 years, but it was probably 4 years until I heard it challenged, because as I said before, it was 2001. So it was about 4 years until I finally heard it challenged. I didn't know there's anybody out there that was keeping it any different. And because I heard it challenged, that's why that I eventually made the change, because I saw that the Roman Seventh-day Sabbath just did not stand up under scrutiny. Now, this is what has impressed me about the Shabbat counted by the luminaries, and what sets it apart from the Roman Sunday Sabbath and the Roman Saturday Sabbath, or the Roman Sunday and Roman Saturday reckonings of the Shabbat. Let me just say that. But what sets the Shabbat counted by the luminaries apart for me is that I see the Shabbat counted by the luminaries, I see it scrutinized, and I see it challenged, I see it maligned, I see it just raked over the coals. I see people just bringing everything but the kitchen sink against the Shabbat counted by the luminaries. But I still see it standing on its own 2 feet after all the smoke clears. I've seen the best of the best. I've seen the strongest of the strongest. I have seen people just drop nuclear weapons upon the Shabbat counted by the luminaries. And then after it's all said and done, it's still standing. I didn't find that to be the case with the Roman seventh day. I did not find that to be the case with the Roman first day. And so, before I close this testimony out, I want to give you something tangible. I don't want to just leave you by saying that, yeah, I see it being challenged, but I see it still standing, and just leave you with something vague like that. I want to leave you with something tangible, okay? And that is this. Now, since I've come to the Shabbat counted by the luminaries, I've learned of even other ways that people keep it. You have the Enoch calendar, Qumran calendar. You have some people that they reset their count to the Shabbat once a year. And so there will be one particular day of the Roman week, and they'll keep it like that all year. So it may be a Roman Tuesday or a Roman Wednesday, and they'll keep it like that the whole year. So instead of resetting every lunar month, they just reset every year. And so that's a fourth category of Shabbat. But out of all of the methods of counting to Shabbat, this has made the difference for me. This is what sets the synchronized Shabbat apart, the Shabbat counted by the luminaries. And this is very important. Okay, so just please listen to what I'm saying here. What I have found is that there is about a half a dozen places in the scripture, in the Tanakh and the New Covenant writings, in the Bible, there are about a half a dozen places where we can actually go and put our Sabbath doctrine to the test. And what I mean by that is that there are places in the scriptures where that it will talk about, it'll either give us a date, or it'll talk about a feast day being nearby, or there's some, and they'll mention a Shabbat in some kind of proximity to it. And so, in other words, you can figure out just where the Shabbat is in relation to a particular date, or it may mention 2 different Shabbats that are like a few months apart, or something like that, where it can be determined when the Shabbat is hitting and how many days are elapsing. That's the whole point. That's the whole point I'm making about. Okay, I'm going to give you a specific example so I could tell you exactly what I'm talking about. All right, and when you read John chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 9, you read about how on the last day of Sukkot, which John calls the last and greatest day. That's literally what he's saying. Now, I know it says last great day, the last day, the great day of the feast, but it literally says the last and greatest day of the feast. Yahusha stood up and he said, If any man thirst, let him come to me, and he that comes to me, let him drink. He that believes on me, as the scripture has said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. Praise Yahuwah. And he spoke this on the last and greatest day of the feast. Now, if you do your research, type this in on a Google search sometime. Hoshana Rabbah. Hoshana Rabbah. Now, this was a tradition that they had intertwined with the Feast of Tabernacles, the Hebrews, where on the final day of Sukkot, they called that the last and greatest day of the feast. That was considered the greatest day. And they had a water ritual that they would do, where they would in a procession, they would line up and go down and fill their pitchers with water in I believe it was the pool of Siloam, and then they would come back up to the temple, and they would like march around the altar, and they would pour the water out, and they would do this one time. But on the last day, on Hoshana Rabbah, the last day of Sukkot, that they would encircle the altar 7 times, and they would pour the water like that. And so you see the connection between water being a big part of Hoshana Rabbah, of the 7th day of Sukkot, the last day of the actual feast, and why Yahusha stood up and said, if any man come to me, if any man thirst, let him come to me. And he that comes to me, let him drink. He that believes on me, as the scripture has said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. And so you see the connection between what he said and what they were doing that day. And so it's very clear that this was the last day of Sukkot, the 7th day of Sukkot, because everywhere in the Hebrew scriptures, it talks about how Sukkot is the 7th. It is a 7-day feast. It's not an 8-day feast. It's a 7-day feast that closes out with a solemn assembly on the 8th day, but it's always called a 7-day feast. And so this is important, okay, because when I move on to what I'm about to say now, you'll see why it's so important that we know that was the 7th day of the feast that Yahusha stood up and he spoke that. Well, the very next day he came to the temple, and there were people there. And the reason why there were people there was because it was the 8th day. That was the 8th day solemn assembly, and it was also the 7th day Shabbat when he came the next morning. Okay, and this is in John chapter 8. So we see the woman caught in adultery. We see that situation. And then afterwards, he gets in a pretty long discourse with the Yahudim and just going back and forth with them in John chapter 8. And we see no lapse in days. It goes right into John chapter 9, where he heals a blind man, and they're making a big deal out of it because he did it on the Shabbat. And so we see that the Shabbat came right after the day that the last and greatest day of the feast, where Yahusha got up and spoke. And so he got up and spoke. That was the 21st. The Shabbat was on the 22nd. And so we see that it fell on the synchronized dates in John chapter 7. But you got to read 7, 8, and 9 to get the full story there. Praise Yahuwah. So it's clear that the Shabbat was on the 22nd. If it was on the 22nd, then it had to be on the 15th as well. That was the beginning of Sukkot, the Sukkot that Yahusha attended. Well, 6 months later, that when Yahusha was executed, that the day after he was executed was the Shabbat. Now, I know some people contest with that. Some people try to throw in another Shabbat, like a high Shabbat or something like that. But the problem with that is that there's no such thing as a high Sabbath that's connected to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You will not find it anywhere in the Hebrew Scriptures where it calls any of the days of unleavened bread high Sabbath. Now, there is set-apart convocation, but the first and last days, but it's never called a high Sabbath. The only feast days that are actually called Sabbaths would be the feast of the seventh month. Okay, you have Day of Atonement, which is an annual Shabbat, and then the rest of the feasts of the seventh month are called Shabbathon. So they're special Sabbaths, but outside of the feast of the seventh month, nothing is ever called high Sabbath like that. So no, there was not a high Sabbath squeezed in there when Yahusha died. Plus, when Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, when they were putting spices on the body, and it took them all night to do that, because keep in mind, I mean, when they spiced the body, we're talking they were putting on about 80 pounds of spices. That took a long time for them to do. They were working all throughout the night to put the spices on Yahusha's body before putting him in the tomb. And the ladies were watching now. Remember the women that were watching? And so they went home, and it said that in Luke chapter 23, after watching Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus spice the body, they went home, and because it said that the Sabbath was drawing nigh, it was growing light. That's literally what the text says. So it was dawning. The sun was about to rise. The Sabbath was drawing near. And so they went home, they prepared their spices, and it said they rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. That's talking about seventh-day Sabbath, brothers and sisters. That's not talking about some high Sabbath, because remember, there is no high Sabbath connected to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So in John 19, verse 31, when it said that they wanted to get the bodies off of the stakes because that Sabbath day was a high day, that literally means that Sabbath day was a great day. The reason why that Sabbath day was a great day was because it was Aviv 15. It was Independence Day for the Hebrew people. It was a day to be memorialized throughout all generations. Praise Yahuwah. That's why that Sabbath, that seventh day Sabbath, was such a great day. It didn't say that that was a high Sabbath day like tradition has turned it into. So many things, brothers and sisters, like Cleopas in Luke chapter 24, and how that when Yahusha disguised himself and he asked, what was going on, and how Cleopas had talked about how the chief priests and how they had did exactly what Yahusha said they would do, and how they were persecuting him, and how they eventually killed him. And Cleopas said, and besides, today is the third day since these things happened. And so the third day, and he's talking about when he was delivered over to the chief priests. That shows right there the sequence. It shows how Yahusha died on the 14th. Then on the 15th was the seventh day Shabbat, and he rose on the 16th, which would be the third day with inclusive reckoning. That's how they did it in Hebrew culture, like that. And so Cleopas, I believe he was a faithful witness because he was right there. He called that the third day, which was Aviv 16, when Yahusha rose from the dead and fulfilled first fruits. Praise Yahuwah. So that Aviv 15 was Shabbat. He died right before a Shabbat, a seventh day Sabbath. That's the point I'm trying to make. If you need more convincing, then I will put more on my channel, the Synchronized Sabbath, just to show you. Praise Yahuwah. He was not in the grave 72 hours. That was not what he was talking about when he said 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The heart of the earth is Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. It's not the grave. Praise Yahuwah. So we can talk further about that on my YouTube channel. But this is the point I'm trying to make, that I said all that to say this. All right, we know that the 15th and the 22nd was seventh day Shabbat, back when Yahusha stood up on Hoshana Rabbah, the 21st, that the 15th and the 22nd were Shabbat. And we know that the 15th of the first month, Aviv 15, was Shabbat when Yahusha died. So this is one of the things I'm talking about when we talk about a testing ground, where there's about a half a dozen places in the scripture where we can actually test our Sabbath doctrine out. Do you know, brothers and sisters, that You cannot connect the 15th of the 7th month to Aviv 15, the 15th of the first month, 6 months later, sometimes 7 months later, if it's an intercalculatory year like that. You cannot connect those two Sabbaths with a perpetual 7-day count to Shabbat. You cannot do it. It cannot be done. With the lunar cycle that we have, and it alternates between 29 and 30 days like that, that cannot be done. I even have a teaching on my YouTube channel there where I go through different scenarios, because sometimes the moon is irregular. So, what if we have 2 30-day months in a row, or 2 29-day months in a row? What if we have 3 in a row of 30-day months or 29-day months? I mean, I test all these different scenarios and show how either way you put it, you cannot connect those two dates, the 15th of the 7th month, and then the 15th of the first month, 6 months later, or even 7 months later. You cannot connect those Sabbaths with a recurring 7-day count. You can't do it, brothers and sisters. That it would have to be an extreme irregularity. We're talking maybe 5 29-day months in a row. And there's actually some software you can use to track lunar phases, even back 2,000 years. And, when you track it back, there were no serious irregularities like that. I've heard it said before that, maybe it has occurred once that maybe there's been like 5 days in a row, or 5 months in a row of 30-day months or 29-day months or whatever. But you can even track using that software and see that there was no serious irregularities of the moon during the stretch of time that could have been referring to. So, brothers and sisters, seeing that you cannot connect those two Sabbaths with the recurring 7-day count to Shabbat, in Yahusha's day, they must have been counting the Shabbat a different way than the Jewish Sabbath, than the traditional Sabbath. And when we see that the Shabbat fell on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, 29th of the 7th month, when Yahusha kept Sukkot, and it fell on the same lunar dates when he died, we see that they reset the count to Shabbat from the new moon. That's how they did it, brothers and sisters, not by a perpetual count. And so, as I said, there's about a half a dozen places in the scripture where you can test the Sabbath out just like that. I'll give you one more. Let's look at the Shabbat in the wilderness. If you look at Exodus chapter 16, and it talks about how they came into the wilderness on the 15th, the very next day was the first day that they got manna. They got manna for 6 days, double manna the 6th day, and no manna the 7th day. And so that 7th day, that first Shabbat that we see the children of Israel keeping, was the 22nd of the 2nd month of the first year of coming out of Mitzrayim, coming out of Egypt. Well, if we look in Joshua chapter 5, and we look at the 40th year, we see that they kept the Pesach, they kept Passover on the 14th of the first month. And then the next day, which would have been the first day of unleavened bread, it specifically tells us in Joshua 5 that they ate bread and parched corn from the old store of the land, from the storage. They couldn't eat it from the fresh produce of the land, because first fruit says that you're not to eat bread and parched corn from the new crop until the priest waves the wave sheaf. See, the wave sheaf has to be offered first before we're able to partake of the new crop of the land. And so it specifically tells us that they ate bread and parched corn from the old crop of the land. See, I think that confuses some people in the law of first fruits in Leviticus 23, when it says you're not to eat bread or parched corn until the self same day that the sheaf is offered And what that means is you're not to eat it from the new crop, because if you're not to eat bread and parched corn at all, then how are you going to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread? You got to make the bread somehow, some way on the 15th. And so it's not saying you're not to have bread and parched corn at all. You're just not to have it from the new crop. And so it said they ate it from the old crop on the 15th. And it said that the day after they ate the bread and the parched corn, it said that the manna ceased, and neither did it fall anymore. Well, if you look in the book of Yasher, it's interesting that it says that the day after Passover that the manna ceased. And so it seems to be contradictory because it's two different dates, but it's really not contradictory, because remember now, the Most High would give 6 days of manna, and then the seventh day he would give none. And so the seventh day Shabbat was a natural ceasing of the manna, that naturally it would cease on that day. Well, if you look at it, that Passover was the 6th day that the manna fell. The natural time for the manna to cease would have been the 15th, like that. And that's where they didn't eat manna. What did they eat? They ate bread and parched corn. See that from the old store of the land. And then the 16th would have been first fruits, where the sheaf was offered, and then they could eat of the produce of the land, the fresh produce of the land from then on, like that. But it can be said that it ceased on the 15th, because that's the natural time for the manna to cease, and it also ceased on the 16th. Like it says in the regular Bibles, it ceased on the day after they ate the bread and parched corn, because it didn't restart. It didn't kick back in. So both are actually right. It ceased on the 15th and it ceased on the 16th. The 15th because the 15th was Shabbat, and then the 16th because that would be the normal time for it to kick back in, and it didn't kick in. And so they just ate of the produce of the land from then on. I said all that to say this. Aviv 15 was Shabbat, okay, in Joshua chapter 5. And so the reason why I said that is because from Exodus chapter 16 to Joshua chapter 5, all right, we are given a range, all right? We're given a range of days where we can actually test it out and see, if the perpetual Shabbat holds up, or if they counted Shabbat by another method. So this is very important to get as a foundation before we get into this. Back then, we had 30-day months and 360-day years, 12 30-day months and a 360-day year back then, okay? And we can even read this. If you read the account of Noah's Ark and how that they went from the 17th of the second month to the 17th of the seventh month, and it called that 150 days. And so that's 5 months. And so we see that the months were 30 days. It didn't alternate between 30 and 29. The months were 30 days. And so nothing had changed between Noah's day and Moses's day like that. We still had 12 30-day months and 360-day years. Now, this did not change until about the 7th or 8th century. Now, there is a book. And this book, if you want to look it up sometime, it's called The Worlds in Collision. The Worlds in Collision. It's by a man that has a Russian sounding name, and he's done some deep research, and he showed how that before the 7th or 8th century, somewhere in there, that all these different cultures throughout the world had 360-day years. But something happened in the heavenlies that altered that, where these different cultures all over the world started changing their calendars in order to get them to match up with the changes that took place in the luminaries, where all of a sudden 5 extra days started to appear per year. Instead of 360, it's 365. This happened somewhere between 7 and 8 BC. Well, biblically speaking, what could that What happened between 7 and 8 BC, biblically speaking, that could have altered the course of the heavenlies? You remember the sundial of Ahaz? You remember Hezekiah and how that Yah told him to ask for a sign, and so Hezekiah wanted to see the sundial go back 10 degrees, and so Yahuwah made the sundial go back 10 degrees. So apparently Yahuwah made an alteration in the heavens that caused the sundial of Ahaz to go back 10 degrees, and that happened between the 7th and 8th century BC, brothers and sisters. That's the point at which all these ancient cultures started changing their calendars. So before then, we had 30-day months, 12 months in a year, 360 day years. And so that's very important when making this count. And so if we want to see how they kept the Shabbat in the wilderness, then we start at the 22nd of the second month, and we count to the end of the month, and that's 8 days. And so from the third month to the 12th month of the first year, that's 10 more months. That would be 300 days. And so here you have 308 days, okay? 308 days from the first Shabbat, which is the 22nd of the second month, until the end of that year. You got 308 days. Now, you can take 360 and multiply it by 38, and then you have the number for the next 38. The number for the next 38 years. And so you add that to 308, and that will bring you to the beginning of the 40th year. And so what I'm going to do, and actually do this here, all right? And so 360 times 38 years would be 13,680 days. Now, we already said that it was 308 days remaining in year one. And so when we add 308 to that, we have 13,988 days from the first Shabbat to the end of the 39th year. Well, in Joshua chapter 5, we already went through, I already showed you how the 15th was Shabbat in Joshua chapter 5. If you add 15 days to that, to the 13,988, then what you get, 13,988 plus 15, you get 14,003 days. So, brothers and sisters, we know Shabbat was on the 22nd of the second month of the first year. We know Shabbat was on the 15th of the first month of the 40th year. From the first Shabbat we see them keeping until the last Shabbat we see them keeping during this 40 years in the wilderness. It's 14,003 days in between those Sabbaths. 14,003 days. Now, brothers and sisters, if the children of Israel kept a recurring seventh-day Sabbath, perpetual 7-day count to Shabbat, a Jewish Sabbath, all right, if they kept the Shabbat that way, then, brothers and sisters, this number should be divisible by 7 with no remainder. So in other words, you're starting now, okay, you're starting at the 22nd of the second month of the first year, and you go 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, perpetual, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. If they kept the Shabbat like that, if they kept the perpetual count, then when you come to the 15th of the first month of the 40th year, then it should be 777 all the way to the 15th of the first month like that. And that number, the number of days from the first Shabbat to the last Shabbat, should be divisible by 7 with no remainder. Well, brothers and sisters, that is not the case. Those of you that are mathematically minded, you could already look at 14,003 and you could already tell that it's not evenly divisible by 7. like that. And so when we do divide it out, we see that it's 2,000. All right, there would have been 2,000. There would have been 2,000 Shabbats. All right, there would have been 2,000 Shabbats if they did a perpetual 7-day count with a remainder of 3 days. You see that? And so with the 2,000 Shabbats, counting from the 22nd of the second month of the first year, you would have hit on the 12th of the month, the first month of the 40th year. You would come up 3 days short. And so the perpetual count to Shabbat does not work when you count how they kept Shabbat in the wilderness, brothers and sisters. Praise Yahuwah. But what you do see was the first Shabbat, that month, the Shabbats fell on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th, the synchronized dates. And then the last Shabbat that they kept, that they fell on the synchronized dates, 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th. And to give you a bonus, the very next month in the 40th year was the month of the Jericho March. In the book of Yasher, chapter 88, it tells us that the Jericho March started on the first day of the month. That would have been the new moon. And we know that they went in an offensive battle maneuver now. All right, they weren't defending themselves. This was an offensive battle maneuver where they marched around city of Jericho one time, and then the 7th day of the Jericho March, they marched around 7 times. The walls fell flat, and they went in and took the city. Well, brothers and sisters, according to the perpetual 7-day count, one of those days had to be the Sabbath. But according to the count by the luminaries, that if it started on the first day of the month, it would have ended on the 7th day of the month, and the 8th day of the month would be Shabbat. There's no conflict there. All right. Now, for people who say, well, because Yah told them to do it, that would justify them doing a Jericho March on Shabbat. To that, I would say that why then did the Maccabees allow themselves to be slaughtered on Shabbat when they were invaded? Now, keep in mind, they were tied to the priesthood, so they knew the scriptures. Surely they would have been able to draw from the Jericho March and say, hey, they were able to march on Shabbat, so why can't we defend ourselves on Shabbat? No, they let themselves be killed. They had to come to the conclusion that, hey, they're going to wipe us out completely if we don't fight them on Shabbat, if we don't at least defend ourselves. So they came to that later on, but there wasn't any precedent to draw from with the Jericho March because they knew that the Jericho March didn't occur on the Shabbat. It occurred on new moon, for starters, and then the 7th day of the month was the last day of the Jericho March, and the 8th day of the month was Shabbat. And so what do you have? You have another month of the synchronized dates, 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th, and you have 2 months in a row of Shabbat on the synchronized dates. Praise Yahuwah in the 40th year. You have the Passover they kept before going into the promised land. In Joshua chapter 5, we see the synchronized dates for that month, and then the Jericho March, we see the synchronized dates for that month as well. 2 months in a row. And so you do the math on that. The only way that can happen is if the Shabbat is counted by the new moon. So I gave you 2 concrete examples. I encourage you to go back over this, get in your own Bibles and test this out for yourself. All right. But I gave you 2 concrete examples. There's about a half a dozen. Like I said, there's about a half a dozen places in Scripture where you can actually count this thing out and determine how they kept Shabbat. You can see, does a perpetual 7-day count work? Or did they count Shabbat by another method? And so that's what seals the deal for me, brothers and sisters, is being able to prove out what I believe in the Bible itself, in the scriptures themselves. We could just go back and forth and argue about dogma all day long. I could try to show you how here it says that, he made the moon for the appointed times. The Sabbath is the first of his appointed times, and you could say to me, well, no, it says 6 days shalt thou labor, 6 days shalt thou labor, do all thy work. The seventh day is the Sabbath. See, it says the seventh day, and to some people, they believe that the perpetual nature of the Shabbat is built into the commandment. Just because he said 6 days shalt thou labor, the seventh day you rest, that automatically means it's perpetual. But brothers and sisters, that can't be the case. If you look at Exodus chapter 23, that you look at the land rest commandment, 6 years you sow, the seventh year you let the land rest. Right underneath it is the Shabbat command, 6 days you labor, and then the seventh day you rest. Those commands are structured the exact same way. There's no difference in how those commands are structured. Yet, we see that the land rest does reset. The land rest is not perpetual. It resets at the year of Jubilee. Now, you may say, well, it resets because Yah said for it to reset, in the year of Jubilee. But the thing is, the Most High, he reset the land rest because it's resettable, because there's nothing within the land rest command itself that disallows it to be reset for Jubilee. And I'm making the same case, brothers and sisters, that I submit that to you about the seventh day Sabbath. There's nothing within the seventh day Sabbath commandment that mandates that it be perpetual. It just says, 6 days shalt thou labor, do all thy work, seventh day is the Sabbath. And so we see that, yes, it's commanded that the seventh day Sabbath follow the 6 working days, but there's no command anywhere in the scripture that the next 6 working days must follow the seventh day Sabbath. You won't find that anywhere in the scriptures. You'll only find that the Sabbath is to follow the 6 working days. So, brothers and sisters, as I said before, there's about a half a dozen places in Scripture where you can test your Sabbath doctrine out. If you disagree with me, what I invite you to do is I invite you to come and check out my channel. Yeah, and I have some videos on there. I plan on doing a podcast on there, and you'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see where these testing grounds are. And I encourage you to test out your Sabbath, all right, with these testing grounds. Test out your Sabbath from Genesis to Revelation to see if it pans out, to see if the math is mathing. That's all I ask you to do. We don't need to argue dogma back and forth. This is how you do it. No, this is how you do it. This is how you do it. No, this is how you do it. We don't have to do that, because the Bible will tell us how they did it in Bible times. Like I said, there's about a half a dozen places where you can determine that. Let's see. Let's put our Sabbath doctrine to the test. See, this is why, because that, we're to prove all things, hold fast that which is good. I found the Roman Sunday Shabbat to be not provable. Weighed in the balance and found wanting. I found the Roman seventh day Shabbat to be not provable. Weighed in the balance and found wanting. But brothers and sisters, like I said, I've seen people open the gates of hell against the synchronized Shabbat, the Shabbat counted by the luminaries, and it's still standing. And why? Because it tests out from Genesis to Revelation. It tests out throughout the whole Bible. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 witnesses, brothers and sisters. That's why I stand 10 toes down on the synchronized Shabbat. So like I said, go to my channel, check out the videos, check out the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my testimony. And so hope to hear from you in the future, and hope to keep Shabbat with you someday. So with that, I will say, Shalom.